All right, I see the screen coming up, so that means we are on. So good evening. It's good to see everybody, and welcome those that are joining online. Before we get started tonight, I want to share something with you. A little bird came by and gave me a little secret here a few minutes ago, and I was told that today is Nancy Spiker's 86th birthday. So I think we need to sing. I think we should sing to you, wouldn't you? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Nancy. Happy birthday to you. Yeah. And many more. All right, happy birthday to you. I'm kind of anticipating my own anniversary coming up here pretty soon. Our anniversary is this coming Friday evening. This coming Friday we'll be doing wedding rehearsal for Junior and Sherry because they're getting married on the 2nd, on Saturday. So when Cindy and I got married, our wedding rehearsal was on a Friday, October 31st, Halloween. And of course, we got married on Saturday, November 1st. And so after we had our wedding rehearsal, we went out trick-or-treating, and in some instances, tricking more than treating. And so I had a good time. So, all right. But anyway, we'll be celebrating 44 years. Goodness. I don't feel old enough to have been married 44 years, but I have been married 44 years. I promise you. So, all right, if you would take your Bibles and let's go to 1 Samuel chapter number 4. And I'm enjoying the study through Samuel. I hope that you are. And we're going to be picking up here, and we'll get through this whole chapter right here this evening. And so last week, we were in chapter 3, and so if you remember, what we were dealing with in chapter number 3 were basically two things. God's first words to Samuel. We talked about how Samuel, that even from the time that he was left with Eli by his mother and father, that he had ministered to the Lord, but it's more out of innocence and just the natural love that children have for the Lord and so forth when they're exposed to that. But he had not come to a place to where he knew the Lord. And so we saw in verse number 7 said, Samuel did not yet know the Lord. And so as God began speaking to Samuel, it was God's personal introduction and Samuel's personal experience of meeting and coming to know the Lord as he called his name out. And of course, he didn't know what was going on. He goes to Eli, and Eli says, first of all, go back to bed first couple of times. But then third time, Eli realized what was going on. And so he told him, said, when the Lord speaks to you again, you say, speak, Lord, your servant's listening. And that's what he did. And so through that first word that God gave him, he comes to know the Lord personally. But then we went on to see how we also saw God's first word through Eli as prophet. And even at the age of approximately 12 years old, based upon what Josephus tells us, Samuel had been given the responsibility of receiving a word from God, a prophetic word from God, that he was going to have to communicate. It was to be communicated to Eli, and which he did. He was a bit afraid to start with, as you might imagine, but he did that. So that's what we had in chapter number 3. So chapter number 4 this evening, we're going to continue looking at the ministry of Samuel as it develops, but there's basically what we're really going to see is Samuel's prophecy that God gave him to Eli was just a confirmation about God's judgment upon the house of Eli. And here, what we're going to see in chapter 4 is where that judgment begins to be carried out. Because you got to remember, the judgment that God had pronounced upon upon Eli's family, his household, was going to go on for generations before it was ultimately completely fulfilled. So we're going to begin in verse number 1, and the first thing that we notice when we get to chapter 4 is about the increasing influence of Samuel. So there was some time that passed from chapter 3 to chapter 4, but not a lot. Samuel's probably still a teenager at this point. However, as verse 1 says, that the word of Samuel came to all Israel. And so what that says to me is two things. First of all, the word about Samuel, that, hey, there's this young man that God's raised up and that he's a prophet. He may be just a kid, a teenager at this point, but God apparently is using him as a prophet. So there was the word about Samuel, but then there was the word of God through Samuel. Because I'm certain that there had been some words the Lord had given Samuel since that first one, and he's been sharing. And so word about Samuel is getting around, and he's sharing what God is giving him to the people. Then we come to the latter part, the next part of verse 1 through verse number 2, where we see that Israel is defeated by the Philistines. And we begin reading in verse 1. It says, "Now Israel went out to battle against the Philistines and encamped beside Ebenezer, and the Philistines encamped in Aphek." Now, so let me ask you a question. When you see the name of the place where Israel and the Philistines were encamped and where this battle is going to take place, Ebenezer is the term that's used. What does that bring to your mind? What does Ebenezer bring to your mind?
To me, it's a song about here I raise my Ebenezer.
There you go. I'm glad we got somebody spiritual in here, all right? I have to admit, I thought about Ebenezer Scrooge too, okay? But yeah, we actually sing a hymn, "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing." The second verse begins like this: "Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I'm come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home." And the idea is that the term Ebenezer simply means the Lord is my help. Now the interesting thing is that this particular place was not formally renamed Ebenezer until we get further into the book of Samuel in chapter 7, 1 Samuel. Samuel is the one that gave the name to that place, but it's kind of a telegraphing, you might say, of what's going on. But that term is actually used here early on. And so they encamped by this area that later becomes known as Ebenezer. And then verse number 2 goes on and says, "Then the Philistines put themselves in battle array against Israel." And there are some historic translations, manuscripts, like for instance, the Septuagint. There are some older translations that basically say that this conflict that breaks out between the Philistines and Israel was actually stirred up and initiated by the Philistines, okay? Verse number 2 goes on and says, and by the way, once it gets started, it doesn't go well for Israel. And verse 2 goes on and says, "And when they joined the battle, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men of the army in the field." And personally, as we go on through this, you'll kind of see the reason why I believe this, but I'm convinced that those older manuscripts are probably correct, that the Philistines did initiate this conflict. So basically what you've got is, you've got an unprovoked conflict between the Israelites and the Philistines that the Israelites didn't do anything to provoke. So in that sense, it's like unprovoked by anybody, but the Philistines attack, okay? But we'll see how that develops as we go along. And so you know as well as I do, if you've been around, you've read the Old Testament, you know that the Philistines just kind of seem to be that arch nemesis of Israel, you know, even back to the Judges, but all the way through the rest of the Old Testament, we find time and time again when they're having issues with the Philistines. And by the way, the Philistines, there was a small group of them, even in the time of Abraham, they were in Canaan even then. They came from the island of Crete. Crete was a military aristocracy. So when the Philistines came to Canaan, they came well armed, better armed than what the Israelites would have been. Basically, Israelites would have been fighting with, you know, maybe some swords and maybe some arrows, but it'd been pitchforks and one thing or another. as opposed to formal military material that the weapons that the Philistines would have had.
Would they have been as large as Goliath? Or all the Philistines, were they as large as?
I don't think that all of them were as big as Goliath. He was kind of a freak of nature, so to speak, But no, nothing that I've read or come across indicates that they were as big as him. Now, they might have been pretty good sized folks, but nothing like Goliath. He was, like I said, he's kind of a freak of nature at that particular point. And so here's the thing to think about. So as we've been in Samuel, we've seen the condition of Eli's sons who are serving as priests, basically instead of Eli, who's high priest. Eli is a guy who, I believe he had a genuine faith, but he was wishy-washy. He was himself carnal. His sons were doing some wicked things. He wouldn't rein them in, and some of the stuff that was going on. And remember, we saw in one of the chapters, I think chapter 2, we saw where people had forsaken going to the tabernacle to worship because of the things that were going on. So as a result, the spiritual state of Israel is dwindling. And there again, remember that when Samuel was born and in his early years is an overlap with the book of Judges. So we know what we saw is going on in the book of Judges. So my point is that for Israel during this time, this was a dark time for them, all right? Add to that, having neighbors like the Philistines to have to deal with makes for some difficult sledding, so to speak, And it's bad enough when you're living for the Lord and you have hard times. It's difficult enough dealing with hard times that come along, even when you're faithful to God. Just imagine how hard it is, and some of us have been there. Hard times come along, but we've put some distance between us and God. It makes those hard times even harder, doesn't it? In fact, sometimes the reason God brings those hard times around is for what reason? To bring us back, which is what we've seen in the book of Judges over and over again. So we see that continued pattern, in a sense, going on even here in Samuel. So Israel is defeated by the Philistines. And by the way, this is the first engagement. There's 2 engagements between Israel and the Philistines. So that leads us to verses 3 through 5. And it's about Israel's misplaced confidence in the ark. Now, so let's kind of talk about this for a moment. So where was the ark? And remember, they don't have the temple yet. They have the tabernacle. All right, and it's in Shiloh. So what does the ark represent? What's the purpose of the Ark of the Covenant? Representation of God's presence. In what part of the tabernacle was it located? In the Holy of Holies. All right? And the scriptures talk about how the glory of God dwelt between the cherubim that were at the top of the seat, the mercy seat there. There again, it also was the mercy seat where the high priest goes in, sprinkles blood on the mercy seat on Day of Atonement, and so forth. Had the second copy of the law, the Old Testament, in there. It had Aaron's rod, or a portion of it anyway, in there that had budded. And so it is significant in that it represents the presence and the glory of God. The object to be focused on is not the ark. The object to be focused on is the God whom the ark represents and is communicating, okay? So it's important to keep that in mind as we read this, because Israel gets that all backwards. And they have this misplaced confidence that they put in the ark in this instance. So verse number 3 says, "And when the people had come into the camp, the elders of Israel said, 'Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines?'" Now, I'll tell you why they were defeated. Is because God has a providential plan in what is going on. And you'll see this play out as we make our way through the chapter. There's a providential plan that's going on. And as I said earlier, a few minutes ago, that's one of the reasons why I believe that those old manuscripts that include in the text that the Philistines initiated this conflict unprovoked by Israel. Okay, keep that in mind. And so it goes on and says, let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord from Shiloh to us, that when it comes among us, it may save us from the hand of our enemies. So let me ask you a question. What is the view that these elders, and by the way, think about this, the term elders, what's that intended to communicate? Wisdom, spiritual maturity, insight, understanding, okay, to help provide proper leadership and guidance for the people. So when they say, let us bring the ark of the covenant from Shiloh so that when it comes among us, it may save us from the hand of our enemies, what were they missing? What's wrong with that statement?
They're seeing the ark as a good luck charm.
Exactly. They're looking at it as if it's like some sort of this a magical religious trinket or a good luck charm, as Don said. Verse 4 says, so the people sent to Shiloh that they might bring from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim. Now here's another thing. There's no direction from God for them to do this. A couple other things to keep in mind is this. It might not have been so much of an issue had they brought the ark out as something that they could use to help direct their attention to God and to worship God, not worship the ark, but to worship the God who is represented by the ark. It might not have been a problem had they come and made sacrifice and maybe even sprinkled blood on it to say, Lord, or it might, if they had fallen on their knees and said, oh God, have mercy, okay? But that's not what they did. They went and got the ark with the intent of turning it into and using it for something other than what God intended.
Is that kind of like people that's not in church? I need to get back in church. Thinking going to church is going to take care of the problem.
Yes, that is like. In fact, I have, for those listening online, Don said, is that not like some folks say, well, I've got to get back in church. I need to get back in church so I can kind of get things straightened out. I've even responded to that statement by some people. And I said, you know what? Getting back in church is wonderful. As a pastor, I love to see people getting back in church, but you better get back in for the right reasons and with the right focus. Because if you don't get in for the right reason, if you don't have your focus in the right place, getting back in church isn't going to change a thing. It might make you a little more religious, but it's not going to change anything, okay? And then notice, if you would, at the end of that, it says this, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. And so then, now what happens in verse number 5, we see the attitude of the elders reflected in the response of the troops. So the elders said, go to Shiloh, get the ark, bring it down here, and let's take it out there on the battlefield. And so they bring it, and it gets there to where the troops are. And verse number 5 says this. Now listen. And when the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel shouted so loudly that the earth shook. Can you imagine that? Shouting so loud that the ground actually shakes. Okay? Now, so let me ask you a question. What would have been a more appropriate response by the troops when they brought the ark into their presence? What would have been a better response? Yeah, demonstrate reverence, awe of God, humility, fall on your knees and cry out for mercy to God and extol God and recognize His holiness and His greatness and His goodness and His kindness and all those kinds of, but they didn't do that, did they? All they did was just shout. Why? Because even to them, they saw the ark as a good luck charm or a get out of jail free card, whatever, however you want to describe it. Okay? Isn't it interesting how their view is so? Now, remember what I said earlier? That because, and we're going to see this as we move further along, Eli has been the high priest and a judge, in a sense, of Israel for 40 years. So you have to ask this question. It's kind of like the politicians ask, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago, right? You got to ask this question. Was Israel any better off as a result of Eli's leadership and influence 40 years later than they were 40 years before? Were they any better off? No. In fact, possibly even worse.
Wasn't the high priest the only one that's supposed to go into the Holy of Holies to even see the ark, right?
Yes, but obviously other priests could accompany the ark if it was being handled and so forth. There were certain ways it had to be handled. But you notice that the scriptures are very clear about telling you who it were, the ones that were the caretakers, the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas. A Bible commentator, Adam Clark, made this comment. Listen to this. Had they humbled themselves and prayed devoutly and fervently for success, they would have been heard and saved. Their shouting proved to be both their vanity and irreligion or irreverence towards God. Now, so that's one thing for us to talk about what they did way back when. Let's bring that up to present day, to our time. Let's bring that up and let's apply this idea, these thoughts to ourselves. And so here's a question. How should we approach God when we come to worship, whether it be here at home or here together corporately at church, or if we're doing our devotional time at home? How should we approach God? Reverently and humility, recognizing and affirming that He is God. I'm not. I'm His redeemed possession, quite honestly, to say it that way. His redeemed child. I'm His servant. He's the head, we're the tail. And so we need to make certain, and sometimes, listen, it's easy to come into church sometimes and be totally distracted and our mind be 10 dozen miles away. It's easy to sit at home wherever we do our own devotion time, and sometimes we read the Bible and it's just like our eyes are just glazed over and we're not focused and we're not really receiving what God has to say. And so there's a right and a wrong way of how we come to worship God ourselves today and how we approach Him. Here's another question. Does your Saturday night or your Sunday morning routine before you come to church, does it have incorporated in some way a time for you to prepare your heart and your mind and your body before you come to worship? I know of, and it's all over the years, as long as I've been pastoring, I've known of people that, it's Saturday night. Man, that's my opportunity to get to stay up late and stay out late and run and go and do this, that, and so forth and so on. And wear your body out and get your mind distracted and maybe even, get your soul dirtied up. And then get up on Sunday morning and jump out of bed and take a shower and jump in the car. And boy, I'm going to come in here and go to Sunday school or church. And there's no conscious preparation or anticipation about what's going to be happening in worship. I mean, I have, and I've done this for 40 years now, 40 plus years, as long as I've been pastoring. Saturday nights, off limits. Rarely ever do I give my time to anybody or anything on Saturday nights, and it certainly is not going to take me late into the night. Because I know that I need to have my heart, my mind, and my body, my spirit, my body also. I need to be refreshed, rested, and ready to go so that I can do what I'm supposed to do as a pastor and to worship God myself, but also to lead and to share from the Word. But if I'm wearing myself out on Saturday night, I can't do that effectively on Sunday. And the fact is that even though you may not be preaching or you may not be up on the platform, you may not be teaching, you can't either. We can't do those kinds of things and then expect that we're going to come to church on Sunday and worship well. There's just not a whole lot of thought that goes into a lot of believers' preparation for worship. And then we just want to nonchalantly just mosey into God's presence and expect God to speak to us and give us an encounter with Him. It just doesn't work that way. And then we come to verses 6 through 9. The Philistines fear the Ark of the Covenant. Now, do you see the difference between what we're talking about? You know, the Israelites, they have this misplaced, this wrong idea, this wrong confidence about the ark, about what it is and what it can do. And they ought to know better than the Philistines. But then we come to this and we see that the Philistines, they fear the Ark of the Covenant. Verse 6, now the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, and they said, what does the sound of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews mean? And then they understood that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp. Now let me ask you a question. Do you really think that the Philistines know a whole lot about the ark? No, they don't. But here's what they do know enough of. They know enough to fear. Because it goes on and says, so the Philistines were afraid, for they said, listen to this, God has come into the camp. Now, some of their wrong understanding goes on a little bit further and says, and they said, woe to us, for such a thing has never happened before. Woe to us. 2 woes. Man, that's pretty strong. Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? Now they start getting pluralistics, demonstrating they don't understand one God and so forth. But it goes on. So, verse 9. These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all the plagues in the wilderness. At least they knew that part. Be strong, conduct yourselves like men, you Philistines, that you do not become servants of the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Conduct yourselves like men and fight. So listen, these guys, they don't understand a whole lot about the ark, but they understand enough to fear God. They said, God has come into the camp. Woe to us. I mean, you got to give those guys some credit and give them compliment that they at least get that part right there.
So isn't that part of what Israelites were hoping would happen? Is that just whatever this ark can do your thing, ark.
I think that what the Israelites are hoping that when they engage in battle, that as a result of the ark being there, that it's going to destroy the army of the Philistines. I don't know that even the Israelites would have anticipated that. I mean, I would think that the Israelites probably would think, well, these pagan Philistines, what in the world are they going to know about the ark? But my point is this. In some sense, the Philistines had more sense and understanding about reverencing God, fearing God, than the Israelites did, especially as it came to the ark.
They knew the history.
Obviously,
They talked about the flight from Egypt.
they were aware.
They knew their history.
And so they demonstrate more fear and reverence of God than what the Israelites do concerning the ark. And so then we come into verses 10 through 11 where Israel is defeated even worse than before. Israel took the ark into battle with them, assuming that it was going to assure them victory. Okay? That's the idea that the ark's going to just like slay this army of the Philistines, but they were wrong. And so here I want to come back to a statement I made back some time ago, a few minutes ago. You remember when I was talking about the Philistines attacking Israel unprovoked? Okay, you remember talking about that? Well, the reality is the Philistines weren't really unprovoked. Who do you think is behind all this? Who do you think is behind the Philistines attacking Israel? They were provoked by God. And you're going to see how that plays out. And remember I talked about there's a providential plan going on here about what God is up to. Okay? And so verse number 10 says this. So the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and every man fled to his tent. There was a very great slaughter, and there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. Also the ark of God was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. And so a couple of things there. First battle encounter they had with the Philistines, about 4,000 men die. This time, 30,000. This is with the ark that they thought was going to be such a magical power, the lucky charm, okay? And the ark is captured, and Hophni and Phinehas are killed. And that gives us a clue right there about what the providential plan is that God's got going. Because what God is doing, he is bringing to pass the judgment that he had said was coming upon Eli's house. Okay? Interesting note. I came across this today. Had not come across this before. Back in the 1970s, 1976 to be exact. I don't know month and all that stuff, but it was 1976. At a site today, modern site today called Isbet Sarte. But what that really is, that is the modern name of Ebenezer. Okay? This site. Okay? So today it's called, as I said, Isbet Sarte, which basically means in English, Ebenezer of Israel. They found in cuneiform writing in an ancient silo a record of this battle right here that dates back like 11th century BC. I mean, it's pretty amazing stuff that they would find that was in essence giving a recording that this is the site where this battle between the Philistines and the Israelites took place. Isn't that amazing? Well, here's an amazing thing for me is how archaeology for years, especially, the liberal wing of theologians and evolutionists, and they write off the Bible and say you can't believe what the Bible says about historical facts, blah, 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 all this kind of thing. And then the modern science of archaeology comes on the scene. And it has done more to substantiate the history of the Bible than it has ever come to question anything. It's just amazing how God uses that over and over and over again. And so here's what happened. Israel turned the ark into an idol. And notice it says, and the ark was captured. So let me ask you a question. When people fall into idolatry, God's people, when God's people fall into idolatry, as God begins dealing with, what's his ultimate goal concerning that idol? And get it out of our life, right? That's exactly what he did with the ark. They turned it into an idol. God took it away from them. And the Philistines got it and had possession of it for a very long time. And we'll deal with that more as we go along in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And so Eli and Hophni, the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, they have been killed. And then we come to the loss of the ark, verses 12 to 22, the loss of the ark and the judgment on Eli's house. And so in other words, the idea here, all of this is tied together. This is God's providential plan of the reason why the Philistines attacked the Israelites. God removes the ark from Israel because they've turned it into an idol, and what he brings to pass is the fulfillment of his judgment on Eli's house. So in verses 12 through 18, we read about the death of Eli. Then a man of Benjamin ran from the battle line the same day, and he came to Shiloh, and that's 20 miles. So 20 miles in a day, that's a long day, especially when you're running. With his clothes torn and dirt on his head, with signs of mourning. And so when people saw him coming as he got close, they could tell this guy's got bad news. He's delivering bad news, okay? Verse 13. Now when he came, there was Eli sitting on a seat by the wayside watching, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. He had a sense things weren't going to go well. And when the man came into the city and told it, all the city cried out. And when Eli heard the noise of the outcry, he said, "What does the sound of this tumult mean?" And the man came quickly and told Eli. And Eli was 98 years old. His eyes were so dim that he could not see. And then the man said to Eli, "I am he who came from the battle, and I fled today from the battle line." And he said, "What happened, my son?" So the messenger answered and said, "Israel has fled before the Philistines. There has been a great slaughter among the people. Also your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured." And then it happened that when he made mention of the ark of God, that Eli fell off the seat backward by the side of the gate. Now notice, it was not the mention of the death of his sons. That was not surprising to him. But the idea that the ark has been captured, that was unexpected. And so he falls off backward by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died, for the man was old and heavy. And so he hears of the ark being captured. He falls backwards because he's such a heavy man. It breaks his neck. He's dead. And then that's where we come and see the statement, and he had judged Israel for 40 years. And like some of the other judges, he was a very poor judge. Okay? Then, verses 19 to 22, we come to that statement, the glory has departed. Verse 19, now his daughter-in-law, Phinehas' wife, was with child, due to be delivered. And when she heard the news that the ark of God was captured and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she bowed herself and gave birth, for her labor pains came upon her. So the news of all of this shocks her system and sends her into labor. Verse 20, and about the same time of her death, the women who stood by her said to her, "Do not fear, for you have borne a son." But she did not answer, nor did she disregard it. Now, all right, be it she's heard bad news, she's had a child, but with all that being said, one of the greatest joys of a Jewish woman would have been able to give her husband a son, or to bear a male child. Even some women dying in childbirth at that point in time would have found some joy and comfort in the fact that I've given birth to a male child. She doesn't even regard it. Verse 21. And then she named the child Ichabod. Now, what does Ichabod make you think of? She named the child Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God has been captured, and because her father-in-law and her husband, because of her father-in-law and husband." And she said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." And she's right. The glory of God had departed, because the ark is a display, a representation of the glory of God. But here's the reality. Listen to this. The truth is, the glory of God had departed even before the ark was captured. Because Israel had turned their eyes from trusting in the God whom the ark represented to trusting in the ark. You see, we can turn anything into an idol. Listen, we can even turn good things into an idol. Parents have to be careful not to turn their children into idols. Grandparents have to be careful not to turn their grandchildren into idols. Spouses have to be careful not to turn their spouse into an idol. We have to be careful not to turn our work into an idol. Our money. Anything can be turned into an idol if we're not careful. H.L. Ellison wrote this. He says this: "The glory of God had indeed departed, but not because the ark of God had been captured. The ark of God had been captured because the glory of God had already departed." So I want you to listen to this and we're going to close. The glory of God departs when individuals, families, churches, nations stop trusting in God and begin trusting in lesser things, which is just another term for idols. If you go with that measure, we have to be honest that in many of our lives, there may be more idols than what we might think. Certainly in our nation and in our churches, there are a lot of people that have turned their eyes from trusting in God and trusting in lesser things. That really is the story of chapter 4. The Israelites chose to stop trusting God and trust in lesser things, and thereby chose idolatry, idols, over God. That's the reason why the glory departed. All right, any questions before we conclude?
I have one, Brother Steve. Before they lost the battle and killed the 4,000, God had left them even before that, or at that time, I guess he had left them, right? 'Cause that was-
Perhaps so. The question is that even before the first battle, when 4,000 died, had God already departed from them? And that very well could be the case, because he already knew the condition of their heart. He knew where they were going. He knew what was coming. So it's like everything else. He knew it way before they did. He always does. So I would say, yeah, very, very likely the glory had already departed even beforehand. Yeah. But again, let me say this. Here's another lesson that comes from these first 4 chapters, but it really kind of comes to a head here in chapter 4, is this. A lot of what was going on here was the result of the poor example and the poor leadership by the ones that were supposed to have been spiritual leaders. God didn't expect them to be perfect and flawless, but the point is, there wasn't even an attempt anymore. And so one of the reasons for God's judgment on Eli's house is because the entire nation had deteriorated as a result of the poor example and the poor leadership. All right, anybody else? All right, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you for joining us online. Have a blessed evening. Thank you. And I will turn it over to Brother Terry. Yes, sir.